Okay, so you should have all gotten um, uh, email from me that has your paper and my comments to your paper. All right, so now you should have two sets of comments for your first draft from your peer reviewer, right? And then from me. And so these are what you can work on over the weekend to move towards getting that finished draft, right? So if you remember, the draft of your paper or the final draft of your paper is due at Tuesday at noon. Okay, so you have basically 3.5 days at this point, right? 4 days um, to be working on that paper, and so that's what you got to be focused on primarily. So I tried to basically in my comments to your papers, I tried to focus on two or three big things that I think you need to work on, right? So I tried to focus on more big picture stuff. Many of you still have some grammatical issues or some just kind of organizational issues on a sentence by sentence basis. That is where you can get help from the Writing Resource Studio. So I did not do a lot of line editing in your papers, right? And I did not do a lot of this sentence doesn't follow from this sentence. And so, that's really, hopefully you got some feedback from your peer reviewer, but the Writing Resource Studio is a great tool as well. Or if you have friends or roommates that owe you one, maybe they can help you with that as well for some of you. So I did try to talk about where I thought you had some just kind of editing issues, but I didn't focus on those a lot in my comments. So only when they were like so bad that I couldn't really understand what you were saying. So anyway, hopefully you have a lot to work with. Remember, I think one problem that I saw for a few of you is remember that the word limit of this paper is 3,500 words. And so there were definitely a number of you whose first drafts were short of that. And so you need to make sure that you have that number of words. If you're short of that, it really means two things. One, you're not providing a sufficient detail to what's going on in your articles, or you probably need to think about adding another source to your paper so that you have more to talk about, right? So I think that for those of you who are short, I think that those are the two suggestions I gave to most of you. Anyway, if you have any questions about the comments I gave, if there's something that's unclear in it, I'll be around this weekend, right? So send me an email, and we can try to exchange some ideas about how you might make your paper better. So that's the paper. Monday we have our presentations, right? And I think I talked a little bit about that yesterday. I don't know what else to say other than you should be putting together a 10 to 15 minute presentation and expecting about 5 minutes of questions or so, right? So 10 to 15 minute presentation, expecting a couple of questions at the end. How you want to do the presentation is really up to you. If you want to make some visuals like a PowerPoint or even just like a Word document that you want to share, or share the paper, that's fine. I'm not requiring that because it is just a short presentation, but you should really in the presentation focus on the kind of the fundamental things that you learned in these papers and how it relates to class. Okay, so in other words, in some sense, I think these presentations are just going to be an expanded version of the conclusions to your paper, right? You have a little bit more time to kind of like get into the conclusions from the articles that you read, but then you want to, in 10 to 15 minutes, you don't have a ton of time, right? So you want to focus on the main results. And then, of course, take a little bit of time to connect those main results to the things that we've talked about in class. All right, so I think we can all go on Monday, right? And I think what we'll do is we'll start, I'll pick a name out of the hat and we'll see how many we get done in the morning. And if a couple of you have to go in the afternoon session, then we'll go in the afternoon session, right? But I think it's best if we just kind of do all these on Monday. Tuesday morning then will be a working session, and Tuesday afternoon we'll have a short class in which we just kind of prepare for the final exam. Okay, so anyway, that's that. So did anybody have any questions about the presentation on Monday? It's all clear? All right, once again, you can reach out to me. And if you have any questions, if you don't know that, for instance, if you have like a little outline for your presentation and you don't know if it's right, or, if you'd like some feedback on it, I may not have time to give you extremely detailed feedback, but I'm happy to give you some brief feedback. So anyway, reach out to me this weekend. Okay, well, today is really the last of the new material that we're covering in class, right? And so, given everything that's going on in the world right now, it seems like this would be an interesting time to talk about the economic impact of pandemics. So we've talked about health before, but we haven't really talked specifically about pandemics. And one of the interesting things is that there's actually quite a bit of research, even before COVID hit, that suggests that pandemics have actually have played an important role in human development and actual economic development. And so I thought it'd be interesting for us to just kind of spend a little bit of time here talking about the role of pandemics and economic growth, okay? And so that's where we're gonna start. And so we're gonna really kind of talk about pandemics during 3 different time periods. First, we're going to talk about pandemics during what's called the foraging era. The foraging era is basically early human history, from about 250,000 to about 10,000 years ago. Then we're going to talk about plagues during the agricultural era. From about 10,000 years ago to about 1700 AD. And then we'll talk about the modern era. We'll talk about pandemics during the last 250 years. Specifically, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Spanish flu, right, which is where the reading that I assigned to you. The Spanish flu of 1914 to 1918. And so just to kind of jump to the end, what are some of the big takeaways that we're going to see as we kind of take a broad look at human history? First off, pandemics are related to economic development, right? There is undoubtedly pandemics have played an important role in economic development. And then economic development contributes to pandemics. How does economic development contribute to pandemics? Well, as we're going to see, more development means more people, and more people means more interaction. And more interaction leads to more income, which helps you fight disease, but it also leads to more disease. Okay, and so there's essentially this, I would say, this balancing effect of development, right? With economic development, you get more, interaction, which increases disease, but you get more income, which helps you fight it. And so this has essentially been the back and forth throughout human history. As we become more developed and we are more integrated with each other, also we tend to have more disease, right? And so strangely enough, in human history, we see examples in which pandemics have greatly harmed economic development, but we've also seen ways in which pandemics have actually contributed to economic development. So there's actually just a very complicated relationship here between pandemics and economic development, where they simultaneously cause each other. But also, pandemics can actually stimulate growth, or they can actually harm growth. And so we're going to try to talk about the avenues by which pandemics impact. Okay, so let's begin here. I'm just going to show you up, instead of writing down a lot of facts and figures, I'm just going to show you this Word document I put together. So let's begin during the foraging era, right? So foraging, we're all kind of familiar with foraging. And this is in fact a picture of sand people, right? S-A-N. So there's very few people that actually live as foragers today. There are a few, in fact, one small group of them is in Botswana. And there's actually a picture of some of the sand people. You can actually go and have some interaction with them. I'm sure they don't live a traditional sand life, but they do in many ways live traditional lives. And so what can we say about the foraging era? And as I said before, the foraging era was about 250,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. Well, the foraging era was the social distancing era, right? By their very nature, these people were social distancing. In other words, they had very, very low population density and very low population growth, right? Very low population density and very low population growth. Why such low population growth? Well, in part because people in general were living on subsistence levels of income. Only about 3,000 calories a day. Okay, so subsistence levels income contributed to the low population density and low growth. Also, the other thing that contributed to low population growth was the fact that these people were moving. And so it was relatively costly to have more children. And in fact, most of these societies developed cultural practices in which if you had twins, one of them was killed, or if you had babies that had some sort of birth defect, babies were killed. And, you know, you can kind of glean that probably a lot of these cultural practices, you know, develop from the economic reality that if you don't have a fully healthy baby, it's very difficult for that baby to survive, and it might actually cost other people their lives during the foraging era. During the foraging era, most of these small groups, all right, and it was small groups, were kin ordered. And by that, I mean that they were family orientated, right? And when it comes to specialization, there was very little specialization. In other words, most people had to know how to do everything. Probably whatever specialization there was took place between men and women, right? So, you know, in many of these traditional societies, it was men that hunted for high calorie, high protein food that was also much more risky and much more uncertain. And women tended to hunt for low calorie, low protein food that was much more certain, right? So that traditional trade-off between hunters and gatherers, right? Women tended to focus on gathering, which was more certain, but maybe in some sense less profitable in terms of protein and calories. And men tended to do the more kind of risky hunting part of the food collection. There was very little networking and sharing of ideas, right? That's why I call this somewhat tongue-in-cheek the social distancing era, right? And so as a result, technology growth was very, very slow, right? Extremely slow. That doesn't mean that people here didn't develop in ideas, right? And in fact, you know, when I took a picture of these people, this is because I actually, it was kind of I don't know if it's touristy or whatever, but you could actually pay to like take a hike with sand people. So I spent like an afternoon hiking around with them. And it was fascinating, right? Because I mean, literally everything in the natural environment they understood, right? They understood how to get water where there looked like there was no water, what you could eat, what you couldn't eat, right? So a lot of information was collected over the years, but very, very slowly, right? Very slowly. And a lot of it is because there's very little networking. The good thing was disease was largely non-existent, right? So during the foraging era, disease was largely non-existent. There just simply wasn't enough population density. And so if disease ever did arise among one group, it's very unlikely to spread to another group. And so we kind of have this kind of strange you know, strange, not strange, but just different relationship during the foraging era, where we actually had no growth and no disease. Of course, we also had no population growth, right? We had no economic growth, no population growth, no disease. During this period of time, the growth rate and the population rate was probably about 0.01% a year, right? So very, very close to zero. So our population growth today is probably about 80 times what it was during this foraging era, just to give you some rough idea. So that's kind of where humans began, right? And then for those of you who are familiar with your world history, you kind of know the next era of human history, which was the Neolithic Revolution, okay? And the Neolithic Revolution was really the move to agriculture, right? And so that's the agrarian era. From about 10,000 BCE to about 1500, maybe 1700, right? Actually, I should probably put 1700 here because that's kind of the break off that we're using for the modern period. The agrarian era, or the Neolithic Revolution, right? So you're all familiar with this term, the Neolithic Revolution, I hope, somewhat. So the Neolithic Revolution was really the move from foraging to having more sedentary populations, right? Where people stopped moving around as much. And so this was the movement to agriculture. And of course, agriculture means farming of plants, but very importantly, it means domestication of animals, right? And agriculture also involves manipulation of the environment, right? In a way that's much different than what we saw during the foraging era. So as people became stationary, they began to manipulate their environment. They began to try to breed animals that are more advantageous and can be domesticated. And then they tried to change their natural environment by, changing the landscape to farm. As we're going to talk about here in a minute, not all animals can be easily domesticated, okay? So domestication is not something that can happen for every kind of animal, right? That some animals have to, by their disposition, be open to be domesticated. But then, of course, there's hundreds, thousands of years of selective breeding that improve the domestication of certain types of animals. But there is a lot of ecological research that suggests that some animals just simply can't be domesticated. And so, kind of the classic example of this is the zebra, right? Zebras are, in many ways, they look like small horses, right? But zebras are not domesticatable in the same way that horses are, right? Zebras are badasses. Right? And zebra bites are actually in certain parts of the world are actually, I wouldn't say common injuries, but not uncommon injuries, because if you get too close to a zebra, they will attack, right? They will attack. And so as a result, not every area of the world was moved to the agrarian era as quickly as other areas that had more animals that were more easily domesticated. The agrarian area also involved a lot of irrigation. And so, for instance, that Fertile Crescent, right, where we think about human history beginning, that really, one of the reasons why that was such an early development area is that it's an area that you could actually do quite a bit of aggressive irrigation, and the populations did that, and that led to big increases in output. There's a lot more division of labor in the agrarian era, right? Like not everybody did everything, right? So you tended to have managers. And so one of the things, and I think I touched on this yesterday, but one of the things we should make clear is, when you had no growth, you had no inequality. One of the things about economic growth is it creates inequality because it actually creates the ability of some people to live above subsistence. Right? In the foraging era, there's very little inequality because most people are living at subsistence. Now, as output begins to go up, there's more opportunity for elites to assert themselves and for some people to live at higher standards than other people. Throughout a lot of this agrarian era, China was the world's largest economy, right? Um, as far as we can tell, at least in terms of overall output, right? Per capita output, meaning actual standards of living, may not have been that much different from most Chinese than it was for most other areas of the world. But in terms of overall levels of output, China was for most of this, probably the richest area of the world. There's also what people call the secondary products revolution, which is animal products that aren't meat, like skins or using bones for fertilizer. And of course, the agrarian area really began to create cities, right? That's when we began to see the role of cities increase in human history. So the spread of ideas, we begin to see networking, leaks and matches. The division of labor and specialization means that people can have deeper knowledge about certain things. And then the power of kinship began to go down, right? So really, and what I mean by the power of kinship here is there's the possibility for meritocracy, that smart people could actually rise in relative power if you had certain skills or certain ideas. Of course, for our perspective, talking about pandemics, what's the important thing to understand about the agrarian era? This is where we begin to get pandemics, right? This is where we begin to get the spread of ideas. In many ways, you have to think about disease as a form of ideas. It spreads very much like ideas, right, in terms of networks. And so disease here, we tended, in this era, we saw a very strong relationship between the spread of disease and economic development. As people got richer, as networks grew, as there was more and more trade, there was also more and more disease. And so what we began to see here is that the richest area of the world were the source of much of our disease, right? And as we're going to talk about, COVID-19 is not the first major pandemic to come out of China, right? In fact, there's a whole series of pandemics that have come out of China. And in part, that is simply a reflection of the fact that China has been more developed than the rest of the world throughout this era and had higher population density and more cities. And so if you have more development, more population density, more cities, you're going to have more disease. And so as a result, we tended to see the world population being quite cyclical in ways that we don't see anymore, right? In other words, as we're going to talk about, we've had periods of time when 20 to 40% of the population has died in certain areas. So, nowadays we kind of think about population as going up and up and up and up, but during the agrarian era, that was not the case, right? Sometimes it would go up and sometimes it would go down. Before we talk about some specific pandemics during this era, I want to just say a word or two about colonization, because colonization was a big spread of disease, a big spreader of disease. And so when we talk about this, this is really kind of going back to this book that I've mentioned or referred to a few times in this class. And I really think that, this is a really good book for not just economics and history buffs to read, but really pretty much everybody, right? I strongly encourage if you need a summer reading book or just a block break book, to get a copy of Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's a really informative book. And so really, as I think I've shared with you a couple of times here, that Diamond argues that, basically Guns, Germs, and Steel talks about what happens when Europeans met up with Americans, right? What happens when Columbus landed in America? And why is it that Europeans, or what he calls Eurasians, have dominated the Americas? And so he said there were natural advantages in Eurasia, which were natural ecological advantages. And so as a result, they made the move to the agrarian era much earlier than they did in the Americas, right? That Neolithic revolution took place much earlier. As a result, when the two cultures met, or the two populations met, the Europeans were much more advanced in terms of technology, in terms of guns, but very importantly, much more exposed to germs. Because by living with animals in the agrarian lifestyle for as long as they had, they'd already developed a number of diseases and developed some population immunity to it. When the Europeans got to the Americas, they brought those diseases with them, generally not on purpose, right? I mean, this wasn't a purposeful thing. Sometimes it was, but in general, it wasn't a purposeful thing. But, and so what happened was that almost immediately, huge portions of the American population died, right? What were the advantages that the Europeans had? Well, they had superior climates for food production, right? There's much more land in the temperate zone in Eurasia than there is in the Americas. And just to kind of think about that why, just think about a map. If you think about Europe and Asia, what's the primary axis? East-west, right? So a huge part of Eurasia is actually in a fairly stable climate zone, right? And so things, you know, when you think about like things like food and animals, they're much easier to move east-west because there's similar climates. Have a much more difficult time moving north to south. And so if you think about the Americas, what's the primary axis of American land? North to south, right? As a result, right, food such as wheat and potatoes and animals were much more able to move widely in Europe than they were to move in the Americas. So just to look at a couple of these advantages. First off, this is a little hard to see, apologize for this, but this is looking at the approximate date of adoption of these important technologies in history and looking at them in Eurasia, meaning either the Fertile Crescent or China or England, or looking them into Native America, in the Andes and the Amazonia, Mesoamerica, and the eastern United States. And so you look at something like plant domestication. That occurred in the Fertile Crescent all the way back in 8500 BC, and in China in 7500 BC. But you look here at the Americas, that didn't occur till about 3000 BC, right? 4,500 years later, right? Same for animal domestication, right? Much, much later, right? And in fact, in Eastern Europe, it never really happened until the Europeans came, right? It never really happened. Pottery, right? Much, much more early advanced in the Fertile Crescent in China than most other areas of the world. Villages, chiefdoms, widespread metal tools, right? Having organized states, meaning having organized government. Writing, right? Writing occurred in the Fertile Crescent in 3200 BC and in China in 1300 BC. But you see in England, it didn't really happen to 4380, right? In this, England looks a lot more like America, right? And probably for obvious reasons. It's an island and is separate from the rest of Europe. Widespread iron tools, right? So in other words, Europeans are getting to these new technologies faster, in part because of the advantages that they had. What are some of these advantages? Look at where most of today's domesticated animals came from. There's only one that originated in the Americas, and that's the llama or the alpaca, right? So 12 of the 13 major domesticatable animals originated in Eurasia. They're just by happenstance have not been very many domesticated animals in Americas, just like there aren't any domesticatable animals in Australia, right, naturally. So this was just one of those accidents of history, that Eurasians had horses and Africans had zebras. And that was an important advantage for Eurasians when the two cultures met. And so animals give you the power of animal power, workhorse power, right? And they allow travel, and they allow you to plow land more easily. But really importantly, as for us, is that we get most of our diseases from animals. Okay? And so these are the deadly gifts from our animal friends. Measles really comes from cattle. Tuberculosis comes from cattle. Smallpox comes from cattle. The flu, right, comes from pigs and ducks. Pertussis comes from pigs or dogs. Malaria from birds, right, likely got into the human population through chickens and ducks. Yeah, so the fact that we live around these animals means that oftentimes the diseases that are in these animal populations have made the jump to humans, right? And so, this happens, and this can happen at any time. And so, we'll have to see how this works out with COVID, right? And as researchers do more research on how the COVID virus jumped to humans, it will be interesting to learn, right? So bats, we don't think of bats as domesticated animals, right? And they certainly are. They're certainly not. Although humans have lived close to areas with bats for, basically all of human history. Exactly how COVID made the jump to the human population is unclear, right? It's unclear. And I would really encourage you not to believe a lot of things that you've heard early in the crisis, because, for instance, one of the things that probably most of you heard is, well, this came from these open animal markets in China, right? Where there's live animals that you can buy, right? If you go to China, they'll have markets where there's live ducks, live pigs, live fish. And so somebody said, well, there was maybe a live bat, or maybe a pangolin, right? A pangolin that might have gotten it from the bat population, and that somebody somehow ate the pangolin, and then they got COVID. I don't think anybody thinks that's the story. I think that was the original hypothesis, but I think mostly scientists have ruled that out. So it's going to be interesting to see how we determine exactly how COVID made the jump to the human population. I don't want to get into any conspiracy theories here, but I do think that there is a possibility that that COVID made the jump to the human population through human help, whether accidental or on purpose, right? And so, once again, I don't know, but some of the things that I've read have suggested that this could have leaked from a lab, right? Some of the early stuff that a lot of people said was more conspiracy theory stuff. I think there's some more people who think that maybe that could have happened, because it's not clear exactly how most disease that have been in the bat population haven't easily jumped to the human population. So I'm getting completely off on tangent here, but we'll have to see, right? We'll have to see. But this happens. Just as another example, in 2016 in Siberia, because of global warming, it unleashed an anthrax virus that hadn't been seen for over 100 years. So basically, the anthrax had been in a reindeer population that died in the early 1900s and then went down into the permafrost. But as the permafrost defrost because of global warming, it released anthrax, and that many indigenous people who lived in the region and who were reindeer herders actually got anthrax, right? So that's, diseases can make the jump, right? They can make the jump. And just when you think they're gone, they can come back. And, that's one of the deadly gifts from our animal friends, as the title to this table says. Really quickly, let's talk about a couple of the diseases. that have existed during during this agrarian era. The first, I don't know how familiar most of you are with the Plague of Athens, but if you've ever taken an ancient history class, almost certainly you've talked about the Plague of Athens. And so the Plague of Athens occurred at about 460 BC, right? 460 BC. And so this was an epidemic that ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for about 5 years, right in the middle of the war between Athens and Sparta, right? The Peloponnesian War, for those of you who are familiar with Greek history. And so the Greek historian Thyclides, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, he wrote, "People in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat and tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath," right? So what was this? Honestly, epidemiologists are still not 100% sure what this plague was, right? What exactly caused it. But almost certainly it was in part driven by overcrowding, in part driven by the war, right? So the war between Sparta led to a lot of displaced people, a lot of them crowded into Athens, making the population density even, denser than it ordinarily would have been. There were a lot of people who were not particularly well fed and weakened. In Athens, a lot of people were forced to kind of take refuge behind the fortifications of the city. And so with all these people there, that facilitated the outbreak of the pandemic, right? Now, one of the things that is really interesting for us to think about the relationship between pandemics and growth is what happened to Athens, right? And Athens ended up losing this war to Sparta and basically disappearing in many ways from its influence on history. And in part because Thyclides argues that the pandemic weakened institutions, right? The pandemic created conflict, and that conflict weakened institutions. So he said the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. Right? In other words, institutions broke down, trust broke down, the organization of society broke down. And as a result, Athens was really not capable anymore of winning the war with Sparta, right? In many ways, completely changing human history. So it was the end of Athenian democracy, right? It was the end of Athenian democracy. And so, that's actually an interesting takeaway, right? Because this is one way that pandemics can impact economic growth. They can weaken institutions, right? They can weaken institutions. Probably the most famous plague in history, that's awfully big. Shrink this picture, right? Is the Black Plague or the bubonic plague. All right, this is probably the one that you are all most familiar with. Yersinia pestis, right? So this is a disease that actually grows in the digestive tract of fleas. Okay, the digestive tract of fleas. So small rodents like rats or mice can get fleas, and these fleas jump off of the mice or the rats and bite humans when they live in close contact with each other. And of course, we know that rats are much more likely in areas where humans live in higher population density. And so almost certainly the bubonic plague really made the jump from animals to humans in places where there was higher population density, right? For those of you who haven't read much about this, it's not a very pleasant way to go to get the plague, right? It essentially impacts your lymph nodes and you have internal bleeding. And it had at its peak about a 60% fatality rate. Okay, so in other words, more than likely, most people who got the plague died from it. It eventually became airborne, meaning that it infected your lungs and could be transferred through breath. And that form of the plague had almost 100% fatality, right? Almost 100% fatality. So the worst of the plague was between 1347 and 1351, right? That's when we think of the Black Plague, that's kind of the era that we tend to think about in human history. But there were many series of plagues that kept on popping up again and again and again. Almost 200 million people died, right? Which, as a percent of the population in Europe, was between 30 and 50% of the population, right? And it took Europe over 200 years to return the previous population levels after the Black Plague disappeared. Where did the Black Plague come from? Well, almost certainly it came from Mongolia, right? China, right? Or close to China. And, it's very interesting that if you actually trace the movement of the plague, it completely follows trade routes, right? And this is, for those of you who are familiar with Chinese history, this is the Chinese Silk Road, right? The path, it's a little hard to see in this. Let me expand this a little bit. But you think about the traditional Chinese Silk Road as connecting Xi'an, right, in central China, to Istanbul, right, in Turkey. And so the Silk Road kind of followed that path. And so very much the plague followed that same path, right? Economic development leading to disease, right? So the trade between people led to contact with people, and contact with people meant that the disease spread, right? The Silk Road in many ways was like a medieval superhighway. And it was along that medieval superhighway that the plague definitely spread. As the plague took place, once again, it led to a lot of social instability and had vast changes on economic institutions. Now, one of the interesting things, though, about the plague, though, was that not all of the changes in institutions were bad. Many of them were bad, right? For instance, one of the things that clearly happened in history was there's big outbreaks of anti-Semitism, right? So a lot of the murdering of Jews throughout this period was closely tied with the arrival of plague, right? The plague broke down a lot of ideas networks and trade networks and set back economic progress for decades or centuries, even in some places. However, there were some good things about the plague, right? Everyone's always dissing the plague, so I'm here to tell you the plague wasn't all bad, right? Because pandemics do change institutions, but sometimes institutions need to be changed. So they can weaken institutions, but they can, in maybe unanticipated ways, they can also strengthen institutions. And so one of the things about the Black Plague was it played a big role in ending feudalism in Europe and allowing labor to move more freely and giving more power to the average working man, right? It changed the balance of power between the lords and the peasants in many parts of Europe. In the words of Malthus, it led to more land per person, which increased wages. And so wages in England rose, probably, depending on the time period, but from 12 to 40%, right? Big increases in wages. What that did is that meant to big increases in calories consumed, right? People got healthier in many ways. The people who did not get plague actually got healthier and they got richer. If you actually go and look at the data, you also saw like a demand for meat and cheese and barley, right? These are more kind of high quality items, right? Suggesting that people were a lot richer. And in England, it had fundamental impacts on institutions in England. First off, it increased the power of peasants, right? There was a huge peasant revolt in which basically people rioted, right? Demanding higher wages, demanding more labor mobility, demanding not to be kind of tied down to the land. And so this is the English Peasant Rebellion of 1381. And so what this did is it basically broke up the feudal system in which serfs were tied to the land. And there was an explosion of social mobility where people could move, people could not just become agricultural workers, but they could do something else. Interestingly enough, while it helped the little guy, it hurt the elites, right? Why? Because the elites, in part because they had more contacts, broader contacts with the wider world, suffered disproportionately from the plague. So here's just a little fact. The number of elites in England dropped precipitously. The number of knights fell from 3,000 to 1,300. 3/4 of the noble families were left without heirs, right? So it killed a lot of elites and left a lot of powerful families without heirs, right? And so it weakened the elites. It strengthened, the general working person who survived the plague. And it actually contributed a lot to inequality. And so this is actually an interesting theme that we see throughout history, is that strangely enough, pandemics have tended to reduce inequality. Right? They've tended to reduce inequality, in part because they really destroy wealth. And who tends to have wealth? The elites. And so I'm not saying that this is a great way to reduce inequality, but it has tended to reduce inequality. Higher wages also encouraged a lot of mechanization and innovation, right? Now that we're starved for people, we need to think about different ways that we can produce. The historian Christopher Dyer says, the time after the Black Death was a time of agitation, excitement, anger, antagonism, and creativity, right? And so, shaking up institutions is not always the worst thing, right? It's not always the worst thing. It can be bad, but in some strange ways, it can also be good. And certainly, and specifically in England, there's some evidence to think that the Black Plague long-term actually had some very positive impacts on British institutions. All right, let me talk about the last agrarian pandemic, the Great Dying in the Americas, right? When Columbus came to the Americas. Okay, and so by some estimates, when the Europeans came to the Americas, they brought with them smallpox and the flu. And Americans had almost no resistance to these. By some estimates, 90% of the indigenous population died within the first 20 years after Columbus's arrival. Right, 90% of the indigenous population. Even within the first year of Columbus's arrival, 20 to 30% of the indigenous population in the Americas might have died, right? So you have places like Hispaniola, which is where Columbus arrived, right? Hispaniola today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So Columbus arrived in 1492, right? And it had a population of hundreds of thousands. By 1519, there were 2,000 indigenous people left, right? So it was a huge Great Dying, right? It was a huge Great Dying. And we've talked about why the Europeans brought with them disease, because they had animals and they had technology, and they had moved to the Neolithic Revolution where most of the Americas had not. And as a result, most Americans were much, much more vulnerable, right? Of all of the major diseases that we think of associated with humans, all of them originated in Europe, except possibly syphilis. Right? But syphilis, without going into it, the history of syphilis is quite complicated. It might have started in the Americas, but almost certainly mutated in Europe. So it's not clear who exactly you can blame syphilis for, but all of the other major diseases originated in Europe, and that's why the Americans were so vulnerable to this. And so, interestingly, if you read histories of these era, one of the things that the Europeans were clearly thought is that they basically said God is gifting us the Americas. Why? Because when we show up, they all die. Must be God's will, right? King James of England said, "There hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of the whole territory, so as there's not left any that can challenge any of our interests. We in our judgment are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time has come in which Almighty God in his great goodness and bounty toward us and our people hath thought fit and determined that those large and godly territories, deserted as they were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by our subjects," right? So, that's kind of how the Europeans viewed the whole thing, right? As just a gift from heaven. And so, that's what we saw, right? That's what we saw. Now, here's an interesting distinction, though. In England, when a huge part of the population died, it actually helped some of the working people. But in the Americas, when a huge part of the population died, did the indigenous people who were left get helped? No. What's the difference? Institutions, right? In England, the people who were left were still thought of as being part of society, right? Institutions adjusted to their demands in part because they were recognized members of society, and in part because they were British. The Brits had better set of institutions than other colonists. So, in fact, what we saw in South America is almost certainly the fact that most of South America was colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese played a big role in the horrible treatment of the indigenous people, right? Because the Spanish and Portuguese, instead of allowing wages to rise, certainly suppressed wages of indigenous people. But let's not get crazy like the British were great colonizers. Of course, one of the long-term ramifications of the Great Dying was because there were so few indigenous people left. Europeans said, well, we need to get people from somewhere. Let's take slaves in Africa, right? And so the fact that slavery was so common in most of the Americas is a direct relationship to the fact that so many indigenous people died. And so once again, that's had dramatic impacts on institutions throughout the Americas. And, we know in the US, right? Obviously, the long-term path dependence, historical ramifications of slavery have played a huge role in what our country looks like and what our economics look like. Okay, so let's take a little break and then let's talk about the modern era. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the Spanish flu, which in some ways is probably, might give us the most insight about what are some of the impacts of COVID, all right? So we'll come back and talk about that, and let's come back at about 10:05, okay? All right, everyone. So let's talk about pandemics of the modern era, right? The modern era, really the last 250 years. And so, first off, what's true about the modern era that kind of shape the role of pandemics? Hold on. What is my... Sorry, something funky is going on with my pad here. Right, so what's going on in the modern era here? Basically 1700 AD on. Well, we just know that there's an increase in population, an increase in population density, and urbanization is full on, right? Today, more than 50% of the population lives in an urban area, and that number almost certainly is going to go up significantly over time. We have increase in life expectancy, and we've had declines in disease mortality. And a lot of it is because of increases in income and increases in technology, right? In other words, we haven't necessarily seen bigger fractions of people dying from disease, even though we've had more population and more population density. Why? Because of the impact of having more income and be able to spend more on health and trying to reduce the impact of disease. One other thing, as we talked about yesterday, there's also been some big increases in inequality, particularly recently, that have been associated with all of this growth. When we think about the disease or pandemics, up to COVID, the primary disease or pandemic that has influenced humans during the modern era is different variants of the flu. Okay. So just to show you a little bit of data here on sorry. I'm sharing your paper, Chase. Here we are. This is what I want to share. Okay, so this is looking at just basically different flu outbreaks during not even the entire modern era, but really over the last 150 years or so. So you see periodically we've had these big flu outbreaks. The biggest undoubtedly is in 1918 with the Spanish flu, right? In fact, it's so big that it kind of comes right up out of the picture here. And then we see other outbreaks, the Asian flu in 1957, the Hong Kong flu in 1968, the bird virus flu in 1997, the Asiatic flu in 2013. Once again, notice here that a lot of these flus really originate in Asia and particularly China. Why? Once again, it's because that China has, for the longest period of time, been the most developed country. It's been the highest population density. And so the longer the time goes on, the more that you have these diseases that essentially have had time to develop in the human population. And so it should not be surprising to any of us that COVID came from China, because that's really where most, not all, but most disease has come from, simply as a reflection of history, right? That it is in China where there's been the longest, where there's been the highest population density, and close proximity to animals, right? So a lot of these flu pandemics have had outbreaks, but in general, the death rates have been much lower because we have been much better at reducing the mortality from it, right? And that is in part because we probably have some level of population immunity, we've developed genetic ways to fight the flu that reduces impact, but also because we just have much better medicines, right? We have vaccines, we have treatments. Nowadays, we know that simple things like IVs are very, very important in reducing the impacts of flu. And then we have an understanding of germ theory, right? We understand sanitation and social distancing. At least some of us understand social distancing more than we used to. Of course, the biggest of these pandemics, and really kind of the pandemic that that has the most historical impact from this period, was the Spanish flu of 1918. Really, it first started in 1914. Then there was a second outbreak in 1918 that really lasted to 1920. So about a fifth of the people who got the Spanish flu died, right? About 100 million people died from the Spanish flu, right? So the mortality rate was about 20%. Compare that to the mortality rate of COVID, which is, considerably, I don't know what the most recent figures are, but considerably less than 0.5%. So, the Spanish flu was 40 times the mortality rates, at least, of COVID. Just like what happened during the Athenian plague, in part the Spanish flu was made worse by World War I, right? Because, once again, here we have a pandemic associated with an outbreak of war. What happens is that, people are living in cramped conditions that help spread the virus. People are weakened, right? That spreads the virus. People living in dirty conditions, right? During World War I, there's a lot of living in trenches. Almost certainly trenches played a big role in spreading the virus. In 1918, as troops began to return home, they brought with them the virus that then began to spread it in the US. Here's something really interesting about the Spanish flu that I didn't know actually until I read this article that I distributed to you. But the Spanish flu is actually hardest on young adults. So the mortality was actually highest between the ages of 20 and 30, and often people who had been previously healthy. So much different than COVID, right? COVID really seems to attack people that have pre-existing conditions and people who are older. The Spanish flu is in many ways just the opposite. It often hit people that were the healthiest the hardest. And it hit people that were younger. Where did the Spanish flu originate from? China, right? Once again, well, it's called the Spanish flu, it really originated from China. The best evidence today suggests that it really started in China and then got transported by Chinese laborers, particularly to the Chinese Labor Corps, who actually worked across the world, including Canada. So Canada was in many ways the epicenter outside of China for the Spanish flu. But pretty quickly it went global, right? So what did we learn from the Garrett paper? Was there anything that jumped out to you in his discussion? Maybe something that jumps out to you that's as similar to similar pandemics and things that were different from other pandemics. Yeah, Chase.
When he talked about the economic impact, some of those headlines seem like they could have been pulled straight out of some of the stuff that we've been reading recently in the headlines, like forcing to close and.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the impact looked a lot similar, right? It looked a lot similar. But in general, was the impact long-lasting or short-lasting? It was short. That's optimistic, right? And in fact, other papers have found this similar result, right, outside of the Garrett paper, that most of the impacts of the influenza of 1918 was short-lived and did not have a permanent influence on the collectivities, but mainly on individuals, right? So of course it had individual impact in that some people died, some people lost their jobs, but on an aggregate basis, right? It did not have a lot of permanent impacts. One of the papers cited in the Garrett study also suggests and this is very similar to what most economists have found during the COVID, is that the impact, the economic impact, is from the virus itself, not from the shutdowns. Okay, so what I mean by this is that there is this kind of belief out there that when governors have shut down the economy, they are responsible for the slowdown in economic activity. But in fact, there's very little correlation between how strict the shutdowns have been and what the economic impact has been. So in other words, it's the virus itself. It's that people don't want to go out because they're afraid of getting sick, or they're afraid of getting sick and then passing it on to family members that might be more vulnerable. And so this is another similarity, right, between, or at least one similarity between COVID and the Spanish flu. Where did the Spanish flu hit the worst? Cities, small towns? Cities, right? Sorry, probably sharing the wrong screen here. So it was worse in places with higher population density, mainly cities, right? And that once again should not be surprising, right? That should not be surprising. And once again, this is another similarity between the Spanish flu and COVID, is that this has basically been the same in COVID, right? That we have higher incidence and higher transmission rates in cities because people are living much more densely in much more dense areas. Here's another similarity with COVID. Who has been the most impacted, whites or non-whites? Non-whites, right? Minorities. So just like during the Spanish flu, non-whites have been much more heavily impacted. And there's a lot of reasons for this. They're more likely to be living in urban areas. That's part of it. But we also know that they're poor. And what this means is that they have less access to healthcare. They also have poor health in general. There's also some evidence that non-whites, regardless of your income level, get worse health care. Right? Things like that, there's been studies that have shown that if you basically put actors in hospitals and you have actors of different ethnicities explain the same set of conditions, then you have doctors rank their conditions on like a 1 to 10 scale. So for instance, what level of pain is the patient in? 1 to 10. What do they find? Given the same symptoms to a doctor will rate a Black person as in less pain than a white person, right? So, you know, these kind of things indicate that the Black people often get worse healthcare, right? And other minorities often get worse healthcare. Sometimes it's because of explicit bias, but a lot of times it's just because of implicit bias, right? So, you know, and this is certainly one of the things that we've seen during COVID is that minorities have a much higher death rate and a much higher hospitalization rate than white people do. And there's probably a lot of reasons for this, right? A lot of reasons as to why this is. So yeah, in many ways, if you look at all these, we can't say about the first one yet, but about all these others, right? All these other things, this is very similar to COVID. Right? So far, a lot of the impacts that we've seen are very similar to COVID. Which is actually interesting. And it really, one of the reasons I wanted you to read this article is to read at the end the author's implications for future pandemics. And to think about, well, have we followed the things that the author said after writing this paper back in 2007? And so let's think about this. One of the things that the author predicted is that future pandemics would be worse. Because of globalization and urbanization. Does this jibe with COVID? I think so. Particularly if you look at the speed at which COVID basically went global, so much faster than what we saw during the Spanish flu, right? And so, yeah, you know, I think the author's warning here that pandemics would likely be worse, and I guess at least along the sense of spreading is definitely true. He makes an argument that you should focus on cities and non-whites. Have we done that? No, no. You know, very clearly, this is one of the problems with our kind of federal system, right? We've really not had a countrywide, at least, you know, that's one of the things the Biden administration is trying to provide us with. But in many ways, we have not had a nationwide approach to this. We've essentially let it up to states and local governments. And so various states have done widely different things. And sometimes it's been good, and sometimes it's been very bad. And, you know, some states have cared and done a good job. Some states have cared and done a bad job. Some states just haven't cared at all. And so, you know, to say that we've consistently focused our resources on cities or on non-whites, I just don't think is true. The authors say there should be more health and life insurance for people. This hasn't really been true either. I mean, the government has done very little to help provide more health care and more life insurance for people. That we should have full quarantines, but short. And by full, I mean really completely restricting people's access to get out and navigate. That the author argues that even if you have like partial quarantines, they're not going to work because even a partial quarantine leads to too much contact, particularly in the modern world we live in, where, you know, a partial quarantine that doesn't stop people from getting a plane means you can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours. Have we done that? Nope. We need a lot more government cooperation in planning. We won't even talk about this one. Have we done it? Nope. At least not yet. The author says, at some level, though, reducing the impact of the pandemic really means more personal responsibility. That people themselves have to take it upon themselves to do the things that they need to do to prevent its spread. Have some people done this? Undoubtedly, some people have done this. But have we done this as a society? Once again, it's hard to argue that we have, right? I mean, of course, mask wearing has gotten a lot more common, but it's not universal. And I mean, you guys know this. I think it's better up in Mount Vernon, but here in Iowa City, it's better than it used to be. But I'm still kind of shocked at some of the things that I see going on around here. And that, I say this might, so, I told you I sent my daughter back to college yesterday. And literally the second I got off class yesterday, I saw an email from her institution saying that they were basically going on lockdown because some students had shown up earlier in the week. They had a party with 50 people, nobody wearing masks, and 35 of them have now tested positive. And then since the couple days of the party, they've interacted with other people, and now the whole place has got to go on lockdown, right? And, so personal responsibility doesn't really just mean 90% of the population. It really needs to be 100%. And that's such a hard thing, particularly for Americans, right? We just have this thing about individual freedom. And this is really a hard thing. It's a hard thing for us. But I do want to talk about one difference between the Spanish flu and other pandemics. Historically, pandemics have tended to reduce inequality. They've tended to reduce inequality. They've tended to destroy wealth in many ways, which has particularly hurt elites. And so, think back to the Black Plague, right? It led to a significant increase in inequality. COVID is increasing inequality. Why? I'll just say it's because of the pros and cons of our idea economy. Right? I don't even know if pros and cons is the right word to say. Let me erase this. Let me just say the inequality of our ideas economy. What happens if you work and your job is an ideas job? Well, listen, your life has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. You can still Zoom. You can still work online. You still have the resources for your kids that even if they're not going to school in person, that you can find other ways to get them an education and supplement your education. And so there's been a lot of research that suggests that, you know, for people who live in those human capital, education intensive jobs, that yes, COVID sucks, but it hasn't been that bad, right? In most part, people have not lost their jobs. And these people have gotten sick less. So these also tend to be the people that were already rich. We know that the more human capital intensive your job is, the better off you are. And so one of the things that's happened here on COVID is that this has reduced the economic impact on the overall economy, right? It's reduced the overall impact on the overall economy because a big segment of the population has largely not been, you know, significantly hurt, at least economically, right? So, you know, this is me. This, in some sense, is you. Is my job as much fun as it was before? No. Is my job more work than it was before? Yes. Do I have the social life that I had before? No. Have my economic situation significantly changed? Not really. I still have a job. Right? I'm paid this year probably what I would have been paid without COVID, right? To some extent. You know, yeah, I mean, in many ways along the margin, my economic situation has been changed, but not fundamentally, right? Not fundamentally. And there's a lot of people who live in it who have ideas-based jobs, such as mine, that really haven't been impacted. And then you have the, you know, the service jobs, the more labor-intensive jobs. That's the other sector of our economy. And they simply haven't had the same ability to Zoom and go online, right? So they've suffered more job losses. They've had to be exposed more because of the nature of their jobs. Right? The kids' education suffers more. My young kids are online today, mainly because of snow, but they're not fully back in school down here in Iowa City. But you know what? Has their education suffered? Yes. Has it suffered a lot? No. In large part because, once again, we can kind of work our jobs around and stay at home with them and work from home while they work at home and, you know, kind of muddle through. But, you know, once again, if you're working at a coffee shop and you have a couple of kids, you don't have the same ability to work at home while you're doing your job, right? And so what that means is that their kids are going to suffer more. They're going to suffer more delay in their education or, you know, lack of progress in their education. And so, listen, I think this is probably something you all are somewhat familiar with, so I won't keep on going on about it. But, you know, this is both the great thing about our ability, our economic response to COVID, and then really a sad thing, right? The great thing is that the economy has not tanked like it might have been without our ability to work online and to do 90% of what we did before still. But on the flip side, it's led to a big increase in inequality. And I think every study suggests that not only is measured inequality rising right now, but there's lots of reasons to think that this is going to have a persistent impact on inequality over the next generation or so. And so that's something that's much different about COVID and something that's very sad. So if I can just kind of summarize here, because I realize we've covered a lot. we covered a lot of different things. And so maybe let's just kind of go back and maybe just hit a couple of big themes before I let you go here. First off, disease and development are intrinsically linked, right, between exchange and population density and networks. You know, cities are pandemic centers and they're idea centers, and for much the same reason, right? And so globalization and integration has helped development, but it's also facilitated pandemics. Pandemics tend to have their biggest impact on our economic institutions, in good ways and in bad ways. So these are disruptors. Pandemics are disruptors. They're social disruptors. The status quo doesn't always hold. So we've had examples of which pandemics have changed institutions in good ways by encouraging more individual rights and more fair political systems. But then they've changed institutions in bad ways by encouraging xenophobia and fear and anger and conflict. What's going to be the impact of COVID? We don't know. But right now, it's hard to feel positive about the impacts on our institutions. We just don't know, right? We don't know. It could be good or it could be bad. Interestingly enough, pandemics have typically reduced inequality, right? But I should add here, I don't know why I didn't add this. COVID is likely different, right? And this a lot is related to the impact of our ideas economy, right? And so while typically pandemics have reduced inequality, that's unlikely to be the result from this pandemic. And then finally, you know, there's a complicated balance between the short-run cost to economic activity needed to protect people, and you don't want to damage the economy in the long term, right? But I do think there's a lot of evidence that governments that kind of did crackdowns very quickly and went to testing and all that, they limited their infection rate, and they also appeared to limit the economic disruption, right? So I have places here like Taiwan, China, and Singapore. I'm not sure if I should include China in here, maybe not. There's a lot of things going on in China. I'm not sure all of it has been particularly good. But you look at a country like Taiwan and Singapore, you know, obviously these are smaller places and they're islands, so they're in many ways more geographically able to protect against COVID. But they've also been very aggressive, right? Very aggressive. And, you know, that's one thing that, you know, we haven't done as much in the US. And you know, that makes you wonder, not only are the short-run impacts of COVID going to be worse, but whether the long-run impacts of COVID are going to be worse. So, all right, well, that seems like a very depressing way to end course material. Despite the fact that I would say that overall, the tenor of this course has been positive, right? I mean, usually when you think about economic growth, there's more good than bad to be said about it. But yeah, maybe everything just feels kind of cranky on a Friday afternoon where we're all tired and we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So, well, anyway, hopefully I have not depressed you. Hopefully you can soldier on and have a little bit of fun, a little bit of free time this weekend, and then also make sure to do some work, okay? And so no class this afternoon. Just make sure that you work on your paper, work on your presentation, and reach out to me if you have any questions, all right? Okay, everybody, have a good one. Take care.